Is it really possible to love one person and be intimate with someone else? It doesn't seem logical. My wife and I had everything we needed: 2 kids, a comfortable home, and a reliable income. She gave me no reason to doubt her, but after more than 20 years, I started to understand that there was an issue with our intimacy. What was actually wrong? One Friday, I had to drive across town to drop off some important files from my precinct at police headquarters. I've been stuck on desk duty for the past 2 weeks because of a shooting incident involving me and my partner. The shooting was deemed justified. We'd been in a standoff with a suspect who pointed a gun at us, and my partner, Jim, was the one who took the "I wasn't the one who got shot," but until internal affairs finished their review. We were both stuck doing paperwork with too much time and nothing to really fill it. I decided to make a quick stop at home on the way. Helen had made a fantastic brisket for dinner the night before, so I figured I could make a decent sandwich for lunch out of the leftovers. It was only a slight detour, and I knew nobody at work would mind. I decided to take a few extra minutes to finish up my errand as I drove down our street. I parked across from Mrs. Ferguson's house and admired her flower garden, which she maintains all year. It was a beautiful sight. Just as I was about to reach my own driveway, I noticed a man stepping out of my front door. It was Mark Malek, a guy I knew from around the neighborhood. I saw a guy from a few streets over who was known as a bit of a computer expert who worked from home. It seemed strange to see him walking out of my house in the middle of the day. I watched him as he strolled around the corner, disappearing from view before finally pulling my car into our driveway. The house was quiet when I entered, but I could hear the sound of a shower running upstairs. As I made my way upstairs and walked into the bedroom, I was taken aback by the scene before me. The bed was a mess, with pillows, sheets, and blankets strewn about. There was a large damp spot in the center, which made it clear what had taken place. The sound of the running shower was followed by Helen's cheerful sing-along, a melody she often hummed when she was in a good mood. My wife actually cheating on me with a guy from around the corner was the last thing I expected. Helen and I had been married for 24 years, and I'd always believed we were happy. We first met back when I was still going through the police academy. She was helping out with the catering at my cousin's wedding, and I couldn't take my eyes off her. She wasn't classically beautiful, but she was petite, charming, and had a way about her that caught my attention after a bit of friendly banter. I got her phone number, and after a year of dating, we decided to get married. Throughout our marriage, things had been good. I worked at the department, and Helen made a career in catering, often doing freelance gigs for a friend's business. This setup allowed her the flexibility to be hands-on. Linda and Veronica were our 2 girls. Linda had already graduated and was working in Chicago, while Veronica was a junior at Kenyon. They were fantastic kids, and Helen had been a dedicated mother. We had a strong bond and shared similar values, agreed on priorities, and genuinely enjoyed each other's company. We'd see other couples barely even speaking to each other. We'd also smile at each other, grateful that we still enjoyed being together even after 20 years. We could always find something to talk about. I knew I was lucky, except when it came to our sex life. Helen was still attractive and had a unique charm that I could never resist. I'll never forget how excited I felt when I first saw her body after we'd been dating for a while. But physical intimacy wasn't a big deal for her. Not long into our marriage, I learned she was perfectly content with being close, maybe once every 10 days or so. This was a stark drop from the 3 or 4 times a week we'd enjoy when we first got together. I couldn't hide my frustration over the years. This was the one issue. That kept coming up. We even saw a counselor for a while, especially when the girls were younger. After years of feeling let down and frustrated, I finally started to understand that her lack of interest wasn't a reflection on me. It was just her natural disposition. Our counselor helped me sort through my resentment, and also guided Helen to I made a bit more effort. Gradually, we shifted from once every 10 days to about once a week, sometimes even twice if I was persistent. I held on to the hope that once our daughters were off to college, Helen and I might rekindle some spark with more free time on our hands. No more running kids to voice lessons, tennis practices, dances, or friends' houses. That's what I thought. I had hoped that things might improve, but that hope never became reality. If anything, it became harder. Our intimacy had dwindled into short, lackluster encounters that left me wishing for warmth and closeness when I tried to connect. She'd often brush me off with a quick, "Not tonight, honey. Let's just make it quick." I was left bewildered, wondering if I thought women usually wanted more connection, not less. The frustration of not being able to truly be close to my own wife for months at a time wore me down. It would be easy to judge my choices, asking why I should stick around if she couldn't meet my needs. But the truth was that Helen and I shared a deep love. She showed her affection in 100 different ways every day. We had this vision of growing old together. Our intimacy wasn't a big part of our relationship, and I'd made my peace with that over time. So, I stumbled down the stairs and out the front door, still in shock and absolutely seedy. I felt torn. I knew Helen loved me. I trusted her implicitly. I was sure that her lack of interest meant she wouldn't. If I was going to cheat, then what? What the hell had I just seen? It didn't take me long to storm over to Mark Malik's house. When he opened the door looking confused and uncertain, I wasted no time. "What are you doing here, Rob?" I didn't let him finish. I shoved the door, making him fall back as I stepped inside and closed it behind me. I grabbed him by the collar and struck him with my knee. I yanked him upright and he doubled over in pain. His pale, frightened face pleased me. He was terrified and speechless. I kept hold of his collar with my left hand and hit him several times before landing a final bone-rattling punch. I tossed him onto the living room couch and watched as he struggled to catch his breath. I spoke slowly and, "Listen up, pal. I know exactly where you were this morning and what you did. I'm on edge. I have a gun and I know how to dig a hole." He just stared back at me. "Why did you die with fear? You're going to answer every question I ask. Then clean yourself up and stay the hell away from Helen. Do you understand me?" I tightened my grip on his collar. He nodded quickly, his voice trembling. "Yes, Rob, I understand." Once I released him, he knew it was time to talk. I made it clear that he'd better be honest. With no downplaying or glossing over, Mark confessed to everything. He admitted that he and Helen had been having an affair for over 2 months. Shockingly, he claimed that she'd been the one too. It all started at a neighborhood event on the 4th of July. They were openly flirting with each other. A few days later, she invited him over to help move a filing cabinet. He showed up and she greeted him in nothing but a bathrobe, thanking him by pulling him into a passionate kiss. They didn't even make it past our bedroom. Mark said Helen had been brimming with excitement. He was always keen to meet up again, and he said he'd asked her several times, "Are you sure this is okay? What about Rob?" She told him she could keep it hidden from me since that first time they met up, and they've been meeting up multiple times a week, sometimes at our place, sometimes at his. This morning he explained that she met him at the door and they went straight upstairs. Listening to Mark's story upstairs, I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. The Helen he described as a passionate, eager woman was nothing like the woman I thought I'd been married to for 24 years. Just one more question lingered before I left him to his mess. I couldn't believe this was his first time in a situation like this. Did she say anything? About others, Mark was thoroughly defeated. He barely hesitated. She'd hinted there had been a few men before him, but only mentioned one, Joe, an older man or Oberman, something like that. A firefighter, she said. She'd said they'd ended things because his wife was beginning to suspect. He and Stephanie had been friends of ours since our girls were 5. That was 2. Helen was lucky I had the afternoon to get myself under control. I was lucky too. If I hadn't had the time to calm down, I might have done something I couldn't take back. By the time I got home for dinner, I had forced my anger deep down and kept it well hidden. Helen greeted me warmly, as cheerful and affectionate as ever. We shared a pleasant meal, chatting casually about the usual things, how the girls were doing, her upcoming catering gigs, and the tedium of my current desk duty. I was surprised at how well I managed to keep my fury buried beneath. Later that night, she was watching a repeat of CSI in bed, and I joined her. The room had been tidied up, the bed made with clean sheets as if nothing unusual had ever happened. I kissed her cheek and let my hand drift. I could see she was still a bit tired, so I kept my hand where it was, moving gently upward. "No, Rob, I need you tonight, Helen. Trust me, you'll enjoy it." "I want to, but I'm exhausted," she said, sounding frustrated. "It's barely 9, I reminded her. 30, you can't be that tired." Her eyes met mine as she replied, "I just don't want to." I dropped a quiet suggestion. "Maybe you could pretend I'm Mark Malik." She tensed immediately, her eyes widening in pure shock. A gasp slipped from her lips. The look on her face was one I'd never seen in our entire time together. Without a word, she agreed to go along with it. I swear, we'd never had a moment quite like that before. When it was over, I got up and left the room without a word, heading straight for the shower. 15 minutes later, I was drying my hair as I stepped back into the bedroom. I saw Helen sitting up in the bed, the nightgown neatly back on, hair brushed, and her face red. It was clear she'd been crying. "Rob," she began, her voice shaking, but I cut her off. "Let me have a word first." I locked eyes with her, my expression cold. "I came by the house earlier today, right before lunch. I saw Mark Malik leaving, and then I came upstairs and found our bedroom in disarray. So don't bother making excuses. Helen, no lies." Her face was flushed with embarrassment, and she looked down, nodding silently. Tears were beginning to fill her eyes. "I don't know if our marriage can survive this," she replied calmly but with a look of horror on her face. "If we have any chance of saving this marriage, it'll start with you being completely honest with me." She nodded again, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm sorry, Rob. I can't believe I've done something so horrible." She paused, struggling to speak through her sobs. "All I ask is that you give me one more chance. I'll tell you everything. But please, please don't hate me." "Fine then. I want the whole truth, you and him. How you met, how long you were together, and why." After a long silence, she wiped her tears and began, "I barely noticed him until the 4th of July picnic. Out of nowhere, he was always around, bringing me drinks, offering me food, just being overly friendly when you weren't nearby. He'd sometimes flirt, stare at me, or lightly touch my back. It was just. A few months ago, I forgot all about it until last week when he called. He asked if he could stop by to go over a recipe he was making for his new girlfriend. I didn't think anything of it, so I said sure. He came over and we worked on the recipe together. I gave him some advice, and he seemed grateful. Then we had coffee, and suddenly I started feeling strange. I felt foggy before I even understood. I had no idea what was going on. He was carrying me up to the bedroom." She paused, her face contorting with pain as she spoke. "I don't know how it even happened. Rob and I asked him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. He's a monster. Afterwards, he confessed he'd slipped something in my drink. Then he showed me a photo of us he'd taken with his digital camera. He threatened that if I didn't keep seeing him, he'd make sure you and everyone at the station saw it. I didn't know what to do. Rob, I was trapped. I listened, but I was skeptical. Her story sounded like a cover, but I decided to hear her out. I pressed on, and what happened this morning?" Her hands clenched, and she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "He called last week, saying he'd be here today at 10. I was told to be ready at 30. I was really worried about the photos, so I let it happen. He came over and it happened again." I took a deep breath. "Helen, why didn't you tell me right after it happened? Do you realize we could have tested your blood and pressed charges for assault?" She looked down, shame clouding her face. "I see that now. I just wasn't thinking straight. I was so terrified of what you'd think of. What you might do." Her face twisted with grief. Fresh tears streaming down. "Rob, Helen's account of what happened seems plausible, but there are still too many gaps in the story. The most incriminating part is her memory of singing cheerfully in the shower just minutes after Malik supposedly pressured her into another encounter. I watched her from across the room, waiting for her to come out of the bathroom. Helen, you acted foolishly. After 25 years together, I thought there was more to the story." She glanced at me with an embarrassed look on her face, almost like a sheepish expression. She murmured, "I'm so sorry, Rob. I need time to figure out how I want to handle this. A few days at least until then. I don't want you talking to Mark or anyone else about this." She nodded, her eyes brightening with a glimmer of hope. "Please, Rob, don't do anything you'll regret." I leaned in, studying her face. "Be honest. Helen, has there been anyone else?" Her eyes met mine briefly before flickering away. I recognized that evasion from countless suspect interviews. "No, Rob," she said quietly. "There's never been anyone else. Only you until Mark." Her voice trailed off as fresh tears streamed down her face, unable to finish her sentence. My anger flared up as I started pacing. "The room, Helen. I want to make this absolutely clear right now. I'm furious with you. You'll be staying in the guest room tonight, so gather your things and go." "But Rob," she stammered, her voice breaking. I cut her off. My tone was firm enough. "I'm done talking for now." Out of the room she went, her expression stunned. I stayed in bed, flipping on the football. I was surprised at how well I slept alone that night. Maybe releasing some tension had helped. The next morning I came downstairs to the smell of coffee. Helen was in the kitchen, preparing a full breakfast: pancakes, sausages, scrambled eggs, and even fresh orange juice. She looked tired but hopeful, and handed me a mug as I walked in. "In the morning, Rob," she said, her voice timid yet warm. "Good morning, Helen," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. The breakfast spread looked amazing. We ate together, exchanging polite conversation, and I watched as Helen gradually seemed to relax. When I'd finished, I pushed back from the table and stood up. I had a plan, and I didn't waste time setting it into motion. I told Helen I had some things to take care of. Then I went straight to my basement workshop and drove to Joe Oldman's house. As I pulled up, he was just leaving with the mail. I waved him over and told him I was going to check out a new car I had my eye on. We went towards Forbes Avenue, where the dealerships were, but I turned into a quiet side street and pulled into a secluded parking lot behind a football field. Joe gazed out the window, seeming distracted, but eventually glanced over. His expression turned puzzled. "Rob, why are we here? What's going on?" I lifted my service revolver, holding it just inches from his face. "You lying bastard. We've been friends for over 15 years, and that didn't stop you from messing around with Helen, did it?" He was drained of color and instinctively pulled back, stammering, "Rob, what are you doing?" "I haven't saved it, Joe. I've already talked to Helen and she told me everything. I'm one step away from pulling this trigger and making you disappear without a trace." He froze, the truth dawning on his face, realizing there was no point in denying it further. Instead, he scrambled to defend himself. "Rob, I swear it wasn't. It was my fault. She kept coming on to me over and over. I told her we were just friends and that it wasn't right, but she wouldn't stop." I lowered the gun just enough for him to breathe, watching him take a deep, shaky breath. His forehead was beating with sweat, his eyes wide with fear. I demanded, slowly and in detail, and told him not to skip a thing if his story didn't match hers. I said I'd make him regret every second of it. Joe was eager to comply, and his version of events matched Mark's. Helen had been the one initiating things for over a year. She'd escalated their usual friendly banter, making subtle advances when no one else was around. Eventually, she propositioned him over the phone. He said he rejected her at first, but her persistence wore him down until Rob said carefully, "You said you wanted every detail, so here it is. Just please lower the gun." I gave him a small nod, still holding the revolver but loosening my grip. "She's the most beautiful woman I've ever been with. I'd never experienced anything like it before. It just happened." His words sent a fresh wave of rage through me, and I had to fight to keep my composure as I stared him down. I asked Joe, my voice low and dangerous, how long this had been going on. He admitted that we'd been meeting once or twice a week for about 8 months. "I was always terrified that you'd find out." Eventually, Stephanie started acting differently, like she was sensing something was off. That's when I told Helen we had to stop. It was last June. How did Helen take that? She was a bit reluctant at first, but she went along with it. She didn't want Stephanie to find out either. I remember she even joked, "Well, I guess I'll just have to find someone else to replace you." "Did you ever ask her why she was doing this?" I leaned in closer, keeping my voice steady. "Plenty of times, even before we started," I said. "I asked her why she wanted to go down this path." He said, looking down, "Nothing that. She'd say she loved you, that you were a good man, but that she needed something more." I paused, taking him in. "Do you think you were her first?" I asked. "No," he admitted reluctantly. "She mentioned a couple of other guys I didn't know. One I think she met at a party she was catering." I leaned back, observing him in silence as he looked out the window, trying to avoid my gaze. After a moment, I let out a sigh. "You're despicable, Joe. I don't care how she was flirting with you, but there was only one right thing to do, and you chose the opposite." He hung his head, unwilling to meet my eyes. It seemed that I wasn't about to go further with my threat. "Our friendship is over, Joe. Get out here, but Rob, it's 10 miles. Get out and look at me." He didn't say another word. He stepped out and walked a few paces away. I turned the car around, leaving him there, and drove straight back to his house. I was lucky enough to find Stephanie at home. "Rob, weren't you just with Joe?" she asked, looking behind me at the empty car. I said that I wasn't offering any details. "Stephanie, could we talk for a bit?" She led me into the kitchen, where we sat down with cups of coffee. "Steph, you and I have been friends for a long time. I don't know any easy way to say this, but Joe and Helen had an affair." Her face showed disbelief, but then her expression hardened. If you told me Joe was with someone else, I might believe you. I did have my suspicions last spring, but Helen, that's impossible. I took out the mini recorder I'd prepared before leaving home without a word and pressed play, letting her listen to my conversation with Joe. I listened alongside her, feeling my own heart break all over again. Stephanie's face tightened with anger and sorrow when the recording ended. She stayed silent, processing the betrayal. "Does any of this make sense to you, Steph?" I finally asked, my voice betraying my own confusion. For years, the four of us have just been friends, joking around a little. There were times you'd playfully pinch me or comment on my swimsuit, but we all understood it was innocent. You didn't come here hoping for a revenge hookup, did you? "For heaven's sake, Steph," I replied, exasperated. "You should know me better than that. We've been friends for a long time. I've known you for a long time, and I care about you. Do you honestly think I'd do that?" Her face softened, and she broke down apologizing. "I'm sorry, Rob. I'm a mess right now and not thinking clearly. It's just so hard to trust anyone right now." I sighed, feeling a pain of sympathy. "Steph, remember that you and I are the ones who were wronged here. You're a beautiful woman, and yes, I'm drawn to you, but that's not why I'm here. I wanted you to know the truth about Joe. I'm here to support you however you need. I'm kicking Helen out of my house, and if there's any way I can help you deal with Joe, I'm here for that too." Still teary-eyed, she walked over and sat on my lap, wrapping her arms around me. She rested her head on my shoulder and began to cry, and soon I felt my own tears slipping down. We sat like that for what felt like ages, two betrayed friends clinging to each other in the silence of her kitchen. The hour-long drive to Chicago gave me plenty of time to think about Helen's betrayals. It was hard to believe how far she'd gone, and it was clear she'd been unfaithful on many occasions over the years, some of which she'd initiated herself. These secret meetings had gone on for weeks, maybe even months. What hurt the most was the sheer shamelessness of it all. While she still pretended to be my wife, Helen had always struggled with inhibitions, reluctance to explore, and an increasingly distant attitude towards intimacy. I'd borne this. I'd always thought our connection was enough, but that illusion was shattered when I uncovered her betrayals with Mark, Joe, and likely others as I left Stephanie's house. Two things were clear to me. My marriage was beyond repair, and Helen would soon understand the full weight of her actions. My first priority, however, was telling my daughters the truth. I reached out to Linda first, arranging to meet her at a nearby diner. She was delighted to see me, and as we shared a meal, caught me up on her new job and the ups and downs of her relationship with Chad. But before long, she sensed something. "I'm fine, Dad. You should tell me what's going on. You seem a bit tense since you arrived. Have you had too much coffee?" I leaned in and spoke quietly. "Linda, I need to tell you something important before you hear it from anyone else. Your mom and I are separating." I found out that she'd been unfaithful to me with multiple men for quite some time. The hours that followed were pretty rough. Linda had a hard time processing what I was saying, and I had to convince her that I was certain about Helen's infidelity. Carefully omitting the most painful details back at her place, she eventually broke down, devastated by the shattered image of her parents' relationship. We cried together that night as I saw the weight of betrayal settle on her shoulders. I stayed on Linda's couch, and before leaving the next morning, I asked her to please not say anything to I'd like to give it a few days until I've spoken with Veronica and started the divorce process. After that, you can decide how you want to interact with her. Just remember that your mom loves you deeply. Whatever she did to me, not to you." I reached Kenyon around 9. It was 10 p.m. Morning. On Sunday, I told Veronica what I'd heard. Our conversation was similar to the one I'd had with Linda. We cried and asked questions. I left for home early Monday morning. I turned my phone on to call in for the day. As soon as it powered up, I saw 11 messages from Helen. They were tearful apologies and increasingly desperate pleas. I deleted them all. I was thinking about how to bring closure to this last chapter of our marriage. It was tough. It was really tough to face up to the fact that my marriage was over. I'd invested a lot of myself in the relationship, and I'd hoped it would last forever. But it wasn't just about that. Helen was having secret meetings with other people and showing me parts of herself that I'd never even seen before. I needed to get a divorce, and I needed to do it properly. So I got in touch with a lawyer to recommend me a good divorce lawyer. I got back to the city and went straight to the lawyer's office. After an hour of discussing my case and providing the relevant documents, I started the divorce process. Custody and alimony weren't an issue for me. My main focus was the house. If Helen tried to dispute it, I'd make the truth public at around 4:00 p.m. I went by the house and noticed Helen's car wasn't in the driveway. I'd arranged for a locksmith to secure the place within the next 24 hours by the time Helen got back at 6 p.m. I had everything ready. I heard her frustration as she fumbled with the front door key before I opened it. Her irritation softened into a mixture of nervousness and hope when she saw me. "Rob, thank goodness you're back. Where have you been for the past 2 days?" "I was worried sick." "Why didn't you call?" she exclaimed, her voice laced with I waved her questions away and told her to come inside. "Helen, take a seat in the living room," I said coolly, stepping back to avoid her attempt to hug me. She followed me to the living room, looking confused. I motioned for her to sit down, keeping my gaze steady as I watched her face. I let the silence stretch long and heavy before finally speaking. "Helen, you know I would never harm you or lay a hand on you. You were once someone I loved deeply." She exhaled slowly, her voice uncertain. "Just because I won't touch you doesn't mean I don't want to. So for once, keep that lying mouth of yours closed and listen, Rob." I said, "Shut up, Helen." I grabbed a hold of my voice and saw the color drain from her face. Her hands were trembling in her lap as fear took over. I said, "We're going to have a calm, respectful conversation." I tried to regain my composure. "And then you're going to leave. I don't care where you go or what you do. This marriage is done. Our life together is over." She gasped as though she wanted to argue, but I gave her a look that was enough to silence her. "You've betrayed me, Helen. You've betrayed me with Mark. You've betrayed me with Joe. You've betrayed me with an older man. I think you've betrayed me with a few others as well. I don't know the full extent of it, and to be honest, I don't really care. For months, maybe even years, you've been giving yourself to other men, offering them what I've wanted, doing with them what you've refused to do with me. Your husband, the one who's loved you, who's been faithful to you, who's built a life with you for over 25 years. If infidelity were you've crossed a line, Helen. It's clear you could give yourself freely to strangers, even one of our closest friends, but never to the man who's been completely devoted to you. I don't even recognize you. I thought I knew who you were, but clearly I was wrong. I would have sworn by your loyalty. I trusted you with my life, but I'm really lucky I didn't." I looked at her. She was sitting on the couch, frozen, tears streaming down her face, too shocked to speak, staring off as if lost in thought. I wondered what might be going through her mind. Was it something like, "Oh no, he knows everything," or maybe this wasn't worth it after all? Either way, it didn't matter anymore. "This is what hurts the most. Helen, you told me you loved me, and I know you believed it. We had plans of growing old together, didn't we? Well, that's gone now. You won't get to grow old beside me. You won't wake up next to me every morning or share this house with me anymore, and you won't even be living here." I gestured. "In just 5 minutes, you'll load those into your car and be gone. You're not coming back." She let out a cry that took me by surprise. "Rob, please, baby," I spat, barely able to contain my contempt. "Yes, I can, and I will. I'm throwing you out, but first let's settle a few things." I stepped in close, looming over her, and saw her pull back slightly, fear flashing in her eyes. I slid my wedding ring off and let it fall into her lap. Her eyes widened, but I wasn't finished. I removed her wedding and engagement rings, dropping the wedding band beside mine, but pocketing the engagement ring. I said, "This is mine. As you know, the house stays with me." I gestured to the wedding rings. "Do whatever you want with them. Melt them down, throw them away, or keep them. They meant something once, but we both know they're worth nothing now." I walked over to the coffee table and picked up a glass vase with a transparent blue and green pattern. "Remember this, Helen. The anniversary gift we gave each other from Venice cost a fortune, didn't it? But we loved it because it was a symbol of our bond." Without hesitation, I smashed it to the floor, watching as it shattered into countless pieces. Helen gasped in anguish, saying it was not worth keeping anymore. I said, turning my back to her, that I was going to grab 2 photo albums from the shelf. I threw them into the fireplace, along with our wedding album and the family album. They were just snapshots of what we'd once been to each other, but they served no purpose now. I poured lighter fluid over them, struck a match and watched as the flames consumed them. Helen cried out and lunged forward, trying to stop me, but I grabbed her and held her back. As she collapsed onto the couch, tears streaming down her face, We watched the albums burn. I placed a hand over the pocket where I'd saved a few pictures of our daughters from the family album. Those memories of our girls were still priceless to me. Within minutes, the albums were reduced to ashes. Helen's shoulders shook as she sobbed. Her face turned away from me. "Helen, that's enough," I said, clapping my hands to break the silence. "The show's over. It's time for you to go." She remained motionless, making no attempt to stand. I took her arm firmly and pulled her to her feet, guiding her toward the front door. "Wait, Rob. Please just wait," she pleaded, resisting as I led her outside. "You can't just throw me out like this." "Oh, I absolutely can, and I will." Her face twisted with desperation and anguish. She didn't even hear me out or let me explain. I took a step back, scrutinizing her in silence for a long, cold moment. "Helen, do you honestly think there's anything you could say that would make me forget the pain and betrayal? Is there anything that could make your infidelity and complete betrayal and the humiliation you've brought on me even a bit easier to bear? Anything that could lessen this pain and make it more tolerable?" I asked, my voice a mix of bitterness and disbelief. "But you haven't even let me explain." Her voice was small and desperate. "Do you think I care about why I exploded?" I couldn't contain the anger. "Do you really believe that understanding your reasons will somehow bring me peace and make everything suddenly all right because I now see Helen's motivations? Are you out of your mind?" She stared back at me, exhausted and frightened. Her eyes were haunted. After a long silence, she finally spoke up. "But what about the girls?" I let out a sigh. "I visited Linda and Ronnie over the weekend. They already know about your infidelity and that I've chosen to end this marriage." Her face fell and she collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. I watched her for a moment, feeling all I felt was a dull, deep sadness. This was my wife, the woman I'd loved, the mother of my children, my partner for over 25 years. But now I could barely recognize her. I left her there, crumpled in the hallway. I went out and loaded her suitcases into the car. When I came back inside, she was sitting where I'd left her, with a vacant look in her eyes. As she stared off into the distance without saying anything, I helped her to her feet and guided her out to the car. The key was on the floor by the driver's door, waiting for her. I put her by the driver's door, looking for the right words to say, but nothing came to mind. "Goodbye, Helen," I said. "I'm sorry you feel this way. I'm really sorry you think I did this." I turned and walked back inside, locking the door behind me. I stood in the hallway and waited for Helen's car to pull away. The silence that followed was heavy and final. For the first time, I felt truly alone. Subscribe and stay one step ahead of cheaters. Trust me, the next story makes this one look like a fairy tale.